October 14th, 1944, 0347 hours. Belgian countryside, 12 kilometers west of Aachen. A German patrol of 18 men moved through morning fog when they heard the sound that had become a nightmare. The high whine of a Jeep engine coming fast, followed by the mechanical scream of Naval Flak guns cycling at 450 rounds per minute. The Jeep burst from the tree line, doing 60 kilometers per hour. A Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun mounted where the backseat should be, and opened fire at point-blank range. The German patrol ceased to exist in 11 seconds. Not killed, erased. When reinforcements arrived at dawn, they found impact craters, shredded equipment, and pieces of men scattered across 40 meters. One survivor, pulled from a ditch with both legs gone, kept repeating the same phrase before he died. Rollende Todeswagen. Rolling Death Wagon. The idea shouldn't have worked. Naval flak guns weighed over a ton, generated recoil forces designed to be absorbed by warship hulls made of steel plate, required external power systems, stable firing platforms, and crews trained in naval gunnery. Mounting one on a quarter-ton Jeep with a chassis made of thin steel and leaf springs was engineering insanity. The recoil alone should have torn the vehicle apart. The weight should have made it immobile. The vibration should have shaken the gun off its mounts after the first burst. But in the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces ground through France and Belgium toward Germany, conventional wisdom was a luxury nobody could afford. The Germans were retreating but fighting viciously, contesting every town, every bridge, every kilometer. Allied air superiority meant German forces moved at night, hit fast, disappeared into forests and villages before artillery could respond. Standard infantry and armor tactics were too slow. By the time heavy weapons arrived, the Germans were gone. What was needed was speed, firepower, and the element of shock. What was needed was something the enemy had never seen before, something that violated every expectation of what was possible. What was needed was someone crazy enough to bolt a naval gun onto a Jeep and see what happened. That someone was Captain Robert Hendricks, a mechanical engineer from Detroit who designed assembly line systems for Ford before the war and understood that innovation was just controlled stupidity with successful results. Hendricks was 32 years old, looked 40 from stress and cigarettes, and had a reputation among his superiors as brilliant, insubordinate, and dangerously creative. He'd already been reprimanded twice for unauthorized modifications to equipment, once for mounting additional armor on reconnaissance vehicles without approval, once for rewiring radio systems to boost range beyond manufacturer specs. Both modifications worked. Both saved lives. Both violated about 40 regulations. His commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel who valued results over protocol, had learned to give Hendricks long leashes and ask questions only after success was confirmed. When Hendricks came to him in early October 1944 with blueprints for mounting a Bofors 40mm naval flak gun onto a Willys MB Jeep, the colonel looked at the drawings for about 30 seconds and said, "This will either win you a medal or a court-martial. Probably both. You have 1 week to prove it works." The Bofors 40mm was a Swedish-designed anti-aircraft gun that had become standard on Allied warships for defense against dive bombers and torpedo planes. Fully automatic, water-cooled, firing 120 rounds per minute in sustained mode, or up to 450 rounds per minute in emergency cyclic rate, effective range of 7,000 meters against aircraft, 3,500 meters against ground targets. Each 40mm high-explosive shell weighed nearly 2 pounds and contained enough explosive to destroy an aircraft or shred light vehicles. The gun itself, with its mount and shield, weighed 1,200 kilograms. The Willys MB Jeep weighed 1,100 kilograms empty. Mounting something that weighed more than the vehicle, it was being mounted on violated basic physics. The recoil force from sustained fire would be approximately 3,000 pounds, transmitted directly into a chassis designed to handle rough terrain at moderate speeds, not absorb forces equivalent to small artillery. Hendricks looked at the numbers and decided physics was negotiable. The first prototype took 4 days to build. Hendricks and his team of 6 mechanics stripped a Jeep down to the frame, reinforced the chassis with welded steel plate salvage from destroyed vehicles, replaced the rear suspension with heavy-duty springs designed for cargo trucks, removed the back seats entirely, and created a mount platform from half-inch steel plate. They bolted the Bofors gun to the platform, ran the mounting bolts through the chassis frame, and secured them with double nut lockdowns, added stabilizing braces that connected the gun mount directly to the front axle assembly to distribute recoil forces across the entire vehicle frame. They moved the ammunition storage to the lowest point possible, directly over the rear axle, using the weight of the ammunition itself as ballast. They stripped everything non-essential from the Jeep: spare tire, tools, even the windshield, which they folded down and removed to reduce weight and wind resistance. The gun would stand in the back, strapped into a harness connected to the roll bar, feet braced against reinforced footplates, hands on the gun controls. The driver would operate the Jeep from the front with a second crew member riding shotgun, responsible for navigation and target spotting. Total crew, 3. Total weight loaded, just under 2,400 kilograms. Maximum theoretical speed, maybe 40 kilometers per hour if the suspension didn't collapse. They tested on October 8, 1944, an artillery range outside Liège, Belgium. Set up steel targets at 200 meters. Hendricks drove. A naval gunner named Petty Officer James Sullivan manned the Bofors. A young lieutenant named Parker rode passenger and tried very hard not to look terrified. They drove the Jeep to 50 meters from the target. Stopped. Sullivan aimed. Fired a 3-round burst. The sound was catastrophic. Not just loud, but felt in the chest, a physical pressure that rattled teeth. The Jeep rocked backward on its suspension, front wheels lifting 6 inches off the ground. The targets disintegrated. The Jeep stayed intact. Hendricks checked the mount, checked the frame, checked the welds. Everything held. No cracks. No stress fractures. No failures. He looked at Sullivan and grinned. Again, he said, but this time moving. They drove past the next set of targets at 30 kilometers per hour. Sullivan fired a 5-second burst as they passed. 25 rounds. The Jeep shuddered and fishtailed but stayed upright and controllable. The targets were obliterated. Hendricks brought the Jeep to a stop and shut off the engine. Climbed out. Inspected every weld, every bolt, every stress point. Still intact. He looked at the lieutenant colonel, who'd come to observe the test. The colonel was staring at the destroyed targets with an expression caught between impressed and horrified. "It works," Hendricks said. The colonel nodded slowly. "Build 5 more," he said. "We deploy in 4 days." The tactical doctrine developed fast because there was no existing doctrine to reference. You couldn't fight a Jeep-mounted Flak gun like infantry. Couldn't use it like armor. Couldn't use it like artillery. It was something entirely new, and new things required new thinking. Hendricks worked with infantry commanders to develop tactics that maximize the platform's strengths. Speed and shock. The Jeeps would operate in pairs, moving fast through terrain that slowed heavier vehicles, hitting targets at close range before they could respond, then disappearing before artillery or counterfire could be organized. They'd target German patrols, supply convoys, rear area positions, anything that wasn't heavily fortified. The goal wasn't hold ground. The goal was disruption, terror, making the Germans afraid to move at night because death could come screaming out of darkness at 80 kilometers per hour with a naval gun that fired faster than human reaction time. The crews trained for a week, practiced high-speed gunnery, practiced firing on the move, firing while turning, firing during emergency stops, practiced ammunition changes under time pressure, practiced escape routes and evasion. By October 13th, they were as ready as they'd ever be. 6 Jeeps, 18 men, enough ammunition to fight for maybe 20 minutes sustained combat before resupply was needed, and orders to cause chaos behind German lines. The first combat deployment was October 14th, the engagement that opened the story. Hendricks led the mission himself, driving the lead Jeep with Sullivan on the Bofors and Parker navigating. They'd received intelligence that a German patrol was moving through a specific sector, try to reach friendly lines after being cut off during an earlier engagement. The patrol was estimated at 15 to 20 men, lightly armed, moving on foot. Standard procedure would be to call in artillery or send an infantry platoon to intercept. But the sector was too close to civilian areas for artillery, and infantry would take too long to position. The Jeeps could get there in 15 minutes and handle it without collateral damage. Probably, the word probably was doing a lot of work in that assessment. They drove without lights through fog and pre-dawn darkness, navigating by compass and memorized maps. At 0345 hours, Parker spotted movement through binoculars. German patrol, 18 men, moving in loose formation through open ground between two tree lines. Perfect target. No civilians. No cover. Hendricks gave hand signals to the second Jeep. We take them from the north. You sweep from the east, catch them in crossfire. Simple plan. The kind that worked or got you killed with nothing in between. At 0347 hours, both Jeeps accelerated to attack speed. 60 kilometers per hour through darkness over rough ground with a ton of naval gun bouncing on improvised mounts. Insane. Suicidal. Hendricks loved it. They burst from the tree line with engines screaming. The German patrol heard them, turned, tried to process what they were seeing. Took 3 seconds. 3 seconds was too long. Sullivan opened fire at 40 meters. The Bofors cycled at full automatic, spitting 40 millimeters high explosive shells at 450 rounds per minute. Each shell hit with the force of a hand grenade. Air burst, ground burst, fragmentation that turned the kill zone into a blender. The German patrol didn't have time to return fire, didn't have time to scatter. The second Jeep hit them from the other angle 5 seconds later, catching the survivors in a crossfire that lasted another 6 seconds. Total engagement time, 11 seconds. Total rounds fired, approximately 90. When the shooting stopped and the echo faded, there was nothing left standing. No wounded, no prisoners, just craters and pieces. Hendricks drove through the kill zone slowly, checking for threats. Found one German soldier still alive in a ditch, both legs severed at mid-thigh from a direct hit, going into shock but still conscious. Parker jumped out to render aid, stopped when he saw the wounds, looked at Hendricks with sick realization that there was nothing to render. The German looked up at them with eyes that had seen something beyond comprehension and whispered, "Rollende Todeswagen, rolling Death Wagon," then died. Parker climbed back into the Jeep without speaking. Hendricks drove back to base in silence. Behind them, dawn revealed a massacre to German reinforcements who arrived an hour later and spent the rest of the day trying to understand what weapon could have caused such destruction. German intelligence reports from mid-October 1944 show confusion and alarm. Patrol after patrol was being annihilated by unknown weapons that appeared suddenly, fired with extraordinary volume and accuracy, then vanished before response was possible. Initial reports suggested mobile anti-aircraft batteries, but the speed and terrain didn't match. Some reports mentioned vehicles, but vehicles couldn't carry weapons heavy enough to produce the observed damage. The confusion was tactical gold for Allied forces. An enemy who doesn't understand what's killing them is an enemy paralyzed by fear. Within a week, German patrols in the affected sectors stopped moving at night entirely. Supply convoys requested armor escorts even for short movements. Rear area positions doubled their sentries and built hasty fortifications against threats they couldn't identify. The rolling Death Wagons, as German soldiers started calling them universally, had achieved their primary objective: disruption through terror, but success created problems. Ammunition consumption was staggering. A single engagement could burn through 200 rounds of 40mm shells in under a minute. Resupply logistics struggled to keep pace. The Jeeps themselves required constant maintenance. The reinforced frames were holding, but the suspensions were taking brutal punishment. Several vehicles developed stress cracks that required field welding. The gun mounts needed retorquing after every engagement because the recoil forces gradually loosened the bolts despite the lockdowns. Hendricks became obsessed with improvement, spent every moment not in combat refining the design, added hydraulic dampeners salvaged from destroyed tanks to absorb some of the recoil forces, redesigned the ammunition storage for faster reloading, added armored shields around the gunner position after Sullivan took shrapnel from an exploding tree during one engagement, modified the engine governors to allow higher speeds. By late October, The second-generation rolling Death Wagons could hit 70 kilometers per hour, carry 300 rounds instead of 200, and sustain fire without degrading accuracy. The crews developed an almost supernatural cohesion. Driver, gunner, and navigator functioned as a single organism. Communication happened through hand signals and instinct because radio chatter during approach would give away position, and shouting during engagement was impossible over the gun noise. They learned to read terrain at high speed in darkness, learned which types of ground would support the vehicle weight and which would bog them down fatally, learned to anticipate how targets would react in the seconds between being spotted and being destroyed, learned to live with what they were doing. That last part was harder than the tactical skills. The rolling Death Wagons didn't fight like conventional weapons, didn't give enemies a chance to surrender, didn't leave wounded. The 40mm high-explosive shells were designed to destroy aircraft, to penetrate aluminum airframes and detonate inside, shredding everything. Against human targets at close range, the results were nightmarish. Men didn't just die, they came apart. The crews tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the tactical necessity, the strategic value, the lives they were saving on the Allied side by, making German operations more difficult. Try to remember that the Germans they were killing were the same Germans who'd invaded Poland, France, Belgium, who'd bombed London, who'd created concentration camps and death squads. Try to justify the unjustifiable nature of what 450 rounds per minute did to human bodies at 40 meters. Some crews handled it better than others. Sullivan never spoke about what he saw through the gun sights, would change the subject if anyone asked. Parker developed a 1,000-yard stare that worried the company medic. Hendricks threw himself into engineering problems and maintenance because wrenches and welding torches didn't ask moral questions. By November 1944, word of the rolling Death Wagons had spread through both armies. Allied forces wanted more of them, requested additional units. Hendricks received orders to train new crews, to standardize the design, to turn his experimental unit into an official program. The requests came with promotions and commendations. Major Hendricks now, with a formal citation for innovation in combat engineering. He accepted the promotion, ignored the commendations, and trained 6 new crews while continuing combat operations with the original teams. The training was brutal, not because the mechanics were complicated, but because the psychology was. You had to teach men to drive at suicidal speeds in darkness, to operate weapons that violated their training and instincts, to kill with such overwhelming violence that the enemy didn't have time to be human before they were erased. Some trainees couldn't do it, washed out not from lack of skill, but from inability to accept what the job required. Hendricks didn't judge them, understood that there was a line some men couldn't cross, and being unable to cross it didn't make them weak, just sane. The men who could cross it, who did cross it every night, those were the ones Hendricks worried about. Worried what they'd be like after the war. Worried if they'd be able to come back from the place combat sent them. The Germans adapted slowly, but inevitably. Started using airburst artillery in areas where Jeep attacks had occurred, trying to catch the vehicles during approach or retreat. Started mining roads and trails that vehicles might use. Started positioning machine gun nests in overlapping fields of fire to suppress fast-moving targets. The adaptation forced counter-adaptation. Hendricks modified tactics. Stopped using roads entirely. Moved through forests and fields where mines were unlikely and prepositioned guns couldn't cover. Approached targets from unexpected angles. Varied timing and routes to prevent pattern recognition. Accepted higher mechanical wear on the vehicles because unpredictability was worth more than maintenance schedules. The cat-and-mouse game escalated through November and December. German casualties mounted. Allied disruption continued. And the rolling Death Wagons became something beyond a weapon system. Became a legend. Became a ghost story German soldiers told each other. Became the sound of an engine in darkness that meant you had 10 seconds to make peace with God before 40mm shells turned the world into fire and fragmentation. December 16th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began. Hitler's last major offensive in the West, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest designed to split Allied armies and recapture the strategic port of Antwerp. The offensive caught Allied forces off guard, overran positions, created chaos and confusion. In the first 48 hours, German forces achieved breakthrough in multiple sectors. Allied commanders scrambled to respond, to stabilize lines, to prevent complete collapse. And in the chaos, someone remembered the rolling Death Wagons. Remembered that they were designed for exactly this kind of situation. Fast-moving threats, unclear front lines, enemy forces advancing through terrain that slowed conventional responses. Hendricks received orders at 0200 hours on December 18th. Take all available jeeps, move to the southern shoulder of the German penetration, hit their supply columns, disrupt their advance, buy time for reinforcements to arrive. No specific targets. No detailed intelligence. Just get behind German lines and cause maximum chaos. The kind of orders that were either a brilliant use of asymmetric warfare or a suicide mission with extra steps. Hendricks assembled his crews at 0300 hours. 8 jeeps now. 24 men, all veterans of at least a dozen engagements. He briefed them in 5 minutes. Showed them maps marked with known German positions. Showed them the supply routes the Germans would likely use. Showed them rally points if they got separated. Didn't sugarcoat the risk. German forces owned the night now. Air support was grounded by weather. Artillery was repositioning. They'd be alone behind enemy lines with no backup, no extraction plan, no support if things went wrong. Anyone who wanted to sit this one out could do so without judgment. No one moved. Sullivan checked his gun. Parker folded the map. The other crews prepped their vehicles in professional silence. At 0330 hours, 8 jeeps rolled out into the snow and darkness of what would become the bloodiest engagement of the Western European campaign. They drove southeast, moving parallel to the German advance, navigating by compass because the snow had covered all landmarks. Temperature was minus 12 Celsius. Snow was falling heavily enough to reduce visibility to 30 meters. Perfect conditions for not being seen. Terrible conditions for seeing targets. They'd have to get close. Very close. At 0515 hours, they found their first target. German supply convoy. 12 trucks moving slowly through snow-covered forest road. Headlights blazing because they believed they were in secure territory. Hendricks made hand signals. For jeeps, take the lead vehicles. For take the rear, simultaneous engagement, no warning shots. They maneuvered into position silently, engines idling, guns aimed. Hendricks counted down on his fingers. 3, 2, 1. 8 Bofors guns opened fire simultaneously. The forest exploded. The lead trucks disintegrated under concentrated 40 millimeters fire. The rear trucks tried to reverse, jackknife it, blocked the road. Drivers bailed out, tried to run. Gunners tracked them with tracer rounds, impersonal and efficient. Fuel trucks exploded. Secondary detonations that lit the forest like daylight. Ammunition trucks cooked off. Rounds detonating in chains that sounded like fireworks. Total engagement, 43 seconds. 12 trucks destroyed. Unknown number of casualties. Hendricks didn't stop to count. Gave the signal to move. They drove away as German infantry arrived and started shooting at shadows and burning vehicles. They hit 3 more convoys over the next 6 hours. Destroyed over 30 vehicles. Killed or wounded several hundred German soldiers. Created traffic jams that delayed entire battalions. But the cost was mounting. 2 jeeps had mechanical failures. Transmissions destroyed by the brutal off-road navigation through snow and forest. 1 jeep hit a concealed crater hidden by snow, broke the front axle, had to be abandoned. Crews consolidated into the remaining 5 vehicles. Ammunition was running critically low. They'd burned through over 2,000 rounds of 40mm shells. Had maybe 500 left. Not enough for another major engagement. And German forces were actively hunting them now. Radio intercepts reported German commanders describing American fast attack vehicles causing havoc in the rear areas, ordering mobile units to locate and destroy them. The hunters had become the hunted. At 1,347 hours, exhausted and low on ammunition, Hendricks made the decision to extract. They'd accomplished the mission, bought time, created chaos. Staying longer would just get them killed without proportional benefit. He set course northwest, back toward Allied lines, hoping the front had stabilized enough that they wouldn't drive into German positions by accident. At 1,420 hours, they ran into a German mechanized unit moving south for Panzer IV tanks with infantry support. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong odds. The Jeeps were fast and lethal against soft targets. Against armor, they were target practice. Hendricks made a split-second decision. Couldn't run. The tanks would machine-gun them to pieces. Couldn't fight conventionally. 40mm shells would barely scratch tank armor. Had to do something unexpected. Something insane. He drove straight at the lead tank at full speed, signaling the other Jeeps to fan out and hit the infantry. Sullivan understood immediately what Hendricks was attempting. The 40mm couldn't penetrate frontal tank armor, but tanks had vulnerable points. Vision ports, track systems, engine grills, and 450 rounds per minute could exploit those vulnerabilities if you got close enough and were willing to die trying. They closed to 60 meters. The tank's machine gun opened fire, tracers snapping past the Jeep. 40 meters. Sullivan aimed low, at the tank's tracks. Fired. The high explosive shells hit the tracks, the sprocket assembly, the road wheels. Not penetrating, just damaging, bending, breaking. 20 meters. The tank tried to traverse its main gun. Too slow, too close. Sullivan walked fire up the tank's glassy plate to the turret ring, to the cupola, to the vision ports. 40mm shells hitting steel at point-blank range, creating spalling on the interior, fragments ricocheting inside the crew compartment. The tank stopped moving. Hatches popped open. Crew bailed out. Hendricks drove past at 70 kilometers per hour, while Sullivan raked the exposed crew with the last of his ammunition. The other Jeeps had hit the infantry, scattered them, broken the formation. But the other 3 tanks were traversing, aiming. Hendricks screamed at his drivers over the radio. Break! Break! Scatter and run. The Jeeps scattered into the forest as tank main guns fired. 75mm high explosive shells detonating where they'd been seconds before. They drove through forest at suicidal speeds, trees whipping past, snow flying, engines redlining. One Jeep didn't make it. Took a direct hit from a tank shell. Disintegrated. Crew gone before they knew they were dead. The remaining 4 Jeeps escaped into forest, regrouped 2 kilometers away. Found they'd expended all ammunition and had 1 wounded. They drove northwest for 3 more hours, moving slowly now, navigating by dead reckoning, hoping they were going the right direction. At 1,647 hours, as daylight faded, they crossed into Allied lines, American infantry positions, challenged by sentries who almost shot them because fast-moving vehicles coming from German territory weren't supposed to be friendly. Hendricks identified himself hoarsely, gave passwords, waited while nervous privates called for officers. Finally cleared through, drove to headquarters, parked the Jeeps, shut off the engines. The silence was overwhelming. 24 men had left at 0330 hours. 17 came back. 1 Jeep destroyed by mechanical failure. 1 by tank fire, 1 crew dead. Hendricks sat in the driver's seat, hands still on the wheel, staring at nothing. Sullivan stood at the gun mount, methodically wiping down the Bofors, even though it was empty. Parker held the folded map in his hands and didn't seem to know what to do with it. They'd done their job, bought time, disrupted German supply lines enough to slow their advance in that sector, probably saved hundreds of Allied lives, probably killed twice that many Germans. And all Hendricks could think was that he wanted to sleep for a week and never hear a Jeep engine again. The rolling Death Wagons continued operating to the Battle of the Bulge. 16 Jeeps eventually, spread across multiple units, conducting hit-and-run attacks on German supply lines, disrupting communications, creating chaos in the rear areas. They didn't change the outcome of the battle. American armor and infantry did that. But they contributed, made things harder for the Germans, made them slower, made them afraid. By January 1945, when the Bulge had been contained and Allied forces resumed their advance into Germany, the rolling Death Wagons had become semi-official. designated as mobile fire support platforms, given formal unit designations, integrated into tactical doctrine. Engineers continued refining the design, adding better suspension systems, improved gun mounts, even experimenting with mounting twin .50 caliber machine guns alongside the Bofors for suppression fire. The Jeeps became less improvised and more standardized, more effective, less insane. Hendricks hated that. The whole point had been to do something unexpected, something the enemy couldn't prepare for. Standardization meant predictability. Predictability meant counters. Counters meant dead crews. He argued with his superiors about it, got overruled, got told that successful innovation gets systematized whether the innovator likes it or not, got promoted to lieutenant colonel, and assigned to train more crews at a base in France, away from the front lines, away from combat, a reward that felt like exile. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. By that time, the rolling Death Wagons had participated in over 300 engagements, destroyed an estimated 400 vehicles, and caused several thousand casualties. Exact numbers were impossible to determine because most engagements happened at night, behind lines, with no formal after-action reports. What was documented was the psychological impact. Post-war interviews with German POWs consistently mentioned the fear of the Rollende Todeswagen, the rolling Death Wagons that appeared from nowhere and left nothing alive. Some German veterans refused to believe they were Jeeps, insisted they must have been specialized armored vehicles because a Jeep couldn't mount weapons that heavy. When shown photographs and technical specifications, many simply refused to accept it. The cognitive dissonance was too great. It couldn't have been a Jeep. Jeeps were scout vehicles, utility transports, not platform for naval anti-aircraft guns that fired faster than machine guns. The fact that it was a Jeep, that something so improvised and unlikely it killed so many, made the fear worse. Because if Jeeps could become death machines, what else might the Americans turn into weapons? After the war, the rolling Death Wagons were quietly discontinued. The Jeeps were returned to standard configuration or scrapped. The Bofors guns were returned to naval inventory. The crews were dispersed to occupation duty or sent home. No official recognition, no formal history, just another improvised solution that had worked for a specific problem in a specific time, then became obsolete when the war ended. Hendricks returned to Detroit, returned to Ford, returned to designing assembly lines and manufacturing systems. Never spoke about the war. His personnel file was classified for 30 years because the rolling Death Wagon program had never been officially acknowledged, and classified operations stayed classified even after they were relevant. He died in 1979, age 67, of a heart attack while working on a production line redesign. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, but no details. At his funeral, 6 men in their 60s showed up unannounced, didn't introduce themselves to the family, stood in the back during the service, left immediately after. Sullivan, Parker, for other crew members who'd survived, they never said goodbye to Hendricks in person. This was the next best thing. The story of the rolling Death Wagons remained obscure for decades. Occasionally, military historians would find references in German casualty reports or Allied maintenance logs, mentions of Jeep-mounted Flak guns, strange casualty patterns in rear area engagements. But without official documentation, the story stayed fragmentary, stayed dismissed as exaggeration or myth. It wasn't until the 1990s, when documents were declassified and veterans started talking more freely, that the full scope became clear. The technical specifications, the engagement records, the innovation process, the psychological impact, and the moral weight carried by the men who'd operated them. Interviews with surviving crew members revealed men who still heard the sound of Bofors guns in their sleep, who couldn't watch war movies because the sanitized Hollywood violence bore no resemblance to what 40mm high-explosive shells did to human beings at close range, who made peace with what they'd done, but never forgotten what it cost. The lesson of the rolling Death Wagons isn't about engineering cleverness or tactical innovation, though those elements are present. It's about adaptation under pressure, about the willingness to look at a problem and ignore the boundaries of what's supposed to be possible. The war needed speed and firepower in a package that could operate behind enemy lines and disappear before response arrived. Conventional solutions didn't exist. So Hendricks created an unconventional solution by bolting a naval gun to a Jeep and hoping physics would cooperate. It did. Barely. And that barely successful improvisation became a weapon system that terrorized German forces for 6 months and influenced tactical thinking for decades. Modern military forces still use the concept. Mounting heavy weapons on light, fast platforms for hit-and-run operations, technical and armored vehicles with oversized guns, helicopter gunships that apply the same principle vertically. The lineage traces back to a Detroit engineer who decided that ton of naval gun plus quarter-ton Jeep equaled rolling Death Wagon if you welded it together correctly and didn't think too hard about why it shouldn't work. But the more important lesson is about cost. Innovation in warfare saves lives on your side by taking lives more efficiently on the other side. That efficiency has a price paid by the men who deliver it. Hendricks and his crews didn't just build and operate a weapon system. They became instruments of industrial-scale killing, personally responsible for hundreds of deaths delivered at such close range that the humanity of their targets was unavoidable. They did it because the mission required it, because the war demanded it, because refusing would have meant other Allied soldiers died instead. They made the choice, lived with it, carried it, and that weight, that moral burden of doing terrible things for necessary reasons, that's the part that doesn't appear in technical specifications or tactical manuals. That's the part that matters most. The rolling Death Wagons were effective, were innovative, were successful by every military metric, and the men who operated them paid for that success with pieces of themselves that never came back from the war. War creates situations where the only available choices are variations of terrible, where the question isn't good versus evil, but lesser evil versus greater evil. The rolling Death Wagons killed hundreds of German soldiers, many of whom were conscripts or volunteers who believed they were defending their homeland, who had families and hopes and futures that ended in 40mm explosions on dark roads in Belgium. Those deaths were tragic, were waste, were crimes against the individual humanity of each person killed, and they were necessary, were justified, were the price of stopping a regime that had murdered millions and planned to murder millions more. Both things are true simultaneously. The deaths were tragic and necessary. The killing was criminal and justified. The men who did it were murderers and heroes. That paradox is the reality of war. And men like Hendricks and Sullivan and Parker and the crews of the rolling Death Wagons had to live inside that paradox every night, had to hold contradictory truths in their minds without resolution, had to be both the thing that saves lives and the thing that ends them. Some men can carry that. Some can't. And the ones who can carry it are changed by the weight in ways that never fully heal. The rolling Death Wagons exist now primarily as footnotes in military history, as photographs and archives showing Jeeps with improbably large guns mounted on them, as mentions in German memoirs describing the terror of vehicles that appear from darkness and deliver death with mechanical efficiency, as case studies in asymmetric warfare and rapid innovation under combat conditions. But they should exist as something more, as a reminder that war drives innovation in directions no one would choose in peace, that desperation creates solutions that shouldn't work but do, that the price of effectiveness is measured not just in enemy casualties, but in the psychological cost of the men who deliver those casualties. The rolling Death Wagons saved Allied lives, disrupted German operations, contributed to victory, and they required men to become killers of such efficiency that the enemy gave them a name that translated directly as death. That's success, that's victory, and that's tragedy. All three, all at once. The men who created and operated the rolling Death Wagons understood that, lived it, survived it when they could, and carried it when they couldn't leave it behind. Subscribe for more stories like this. Where are you watching from? Comment below.